the Mulholland Drive video, Faith and Begora. So I always thought that both assessments, common assessments, of the film were kind of puerile and reductionist. Certainly those who dismiss and scoff at the film, isn't that at least as arrogant as those who consider themselves superior or enlightened for appreciating or understanding the film? To claim to have uncovered the Emperor's New Clothes charade unique in the discourse on film, which tends to hold Mulholland Drive in incredibly high regard, does reek of a putrid arrogance. Conversely, the idea of putting the pieces together and determining via claims of deliberate symbolism, covert clues, and conscious cryptography on Lynch's part seems to be unintuitive to the idea of composing a film, that Lynch placed all of the elements together, rubbing his hands, wondering if anyone will figure out the mystery. The fact is, we all know, or ought to, the origins of this feature, a pilot production intended for ABC, that's the American ABC. They rejected it and he turned what he had via additional shooting into an extended feature film. If there was a master plan, he devised it later. He realized that he could compose a cryptic exercise via the existing footage and new correlating footage to round it out. It seems clear that Lynch did have a vision, a mystery in mind with the film in its finished form, although I suspect it is far looser than many want to feel. You would think, the way some write about this film, that Lynch devised it as though it were the Voynich manuscript. I think that Lynch preferred the implications of images and knew that explanations would hurt the emotional power of these aesthetic highs. He was right. He created Twin Peaks. Who was more aware of that show's diminished prowess and occasional resurgences than him? Lynch prefers dream metaphor to literary metaphor. Dream metaphors are subtler, subconscious priorities manifesting as recognized images in a dream state, versus a contrived act of analogy or deliberated symbolism. For a traditional reading of this film as a dream/fantasy state, dissipating and revealing itself as the product of a disgruntled woman's preferred idealized circumstances, I have to admit, it makes me like the film a little bit less. Think about it. As a pitch, that whole idea is kind of hacky and soap opera-y. It only seems exciting because it was a deciphered mystery from a highly ambiguous film. What I do like is the somewhat common assertion that it is more like Sunset Boulevard than most younger viewers realize, not having seen or condescendingly dismissive of Sunset Boulevard or old Hollywood's artistic triumphs in general, than it could seem on the surface. The notion that the aunt is the central character, Naomi Watts figuring as either her idealized self or some reincarnation of her, is quite compelling because her appearances and depicted behaviors in the film are not just manifestations of random weirdness, as many Lynch choices can and have been crassly perceived as. She appears before the alleged dream disintegrates. She smiles as she notices Rita enter her home initially. Most commentators claim that this is because Rita is not visible to characters other than Betty. I'm unsure if this is consistently the case during this portion of the film, and yet is specifically referred to during the film's final portion, and as having been deceased at that. Did an old lady taken Rita, led into Hollywood by elderly people, an audition overseen by elderly folk, tormented at the close by aging figures, mocking her sadistically to her eventual demise? The final feature is plausibly closer to Kubrick's ghostly implications and more ethereal series of suggestions in 1980's The Shining, which almost feels like a conscious effort to illustrate the power of symbols in interpreting, potentially inspired by the reactions to 2001: A Space Odyssey, wherein the filmmaker is more interested in how people draw conclusions and what has to occur in order for people to gauge these hidden hints, and the hopeless search for profundity and meaning in general. A few observations I have watching this feature again are: does Lynch believe that everything sick about the developed world today, dashed hopes and dreams, a hierarchy of fortunate versus less fortunate folks, and infantilized visions of the world, are Hollywood's fault? Lynch loves classical Hollywood, but his films couldn't be less Hollywood. He likes the dream and what it implies about our real selves, but he might hate how Hollywood is perceived as the gold standard of dreaming, and that films like his are relegated to art house or student snob circles. I like the idea that Rita is lying to Betty about her amnesia, although given the dream implications, this might be inconsequential and a vestige of when Mulholland Drive was meant as an ongoing story, featuring Robert Forster as a detective in the cast, no less. Also, if everything in this film is as machinated as some enthusiasts claim, then so is the attention upon Rita's bosom and Betty's healthy figure, or maybe that is just my own vapid thirst. It might have been practical for them to become the same individual, able to tackle Hollywood's wants on all fronts, but perhaps one deduced a director's companionship would be a finer unit, an embrace of the heteronormative in lieu of the convicted grace of the depicted same-sex relationships in this film. Diane does not obviously take this very well, as we know. Lynch likely realised a lot of implications that could be drawn from the film, like a ghostly presence, as Kubrick had in The Shining, and wanted to keep it that way, enjoying the sum of mystery and supposed clues and connections viewers could make, believing this to be of substance in of itself. Considering how underwhelming explanations can eventually be, I myself find the dream interpretation to reduce the film's power, to be brutally truthful. I'm very grateful for more of Lynch's ambiguity here than not. Now, let me elaborate upon another notion present in this film, also somewhat similar to Kubrick's efforts in The Shining. What if some locations become so large, so stuffed with relevant history, that time and space begin to collapse in on itself, all occurring at the same once and where? In Jorge Luis Borges' The Man on the Threshold, our narrator protagonist is searching for the missing British officer Glencairn in India under the rule of the British Raj. The narrator deduces that not one individual in the city he searches amongst is not aware of Glencairn's location or fate, even though they all either lie or smirk to his face. Finally, defeated and exhausted, stumped, the narrator winds up conversing with an old beggar lying on the floor of a building. Hopelessly asking this man for Glencairn's whereabouts, the old man goes on a long explanatory tirade about how when he was a boy, a British official, a judge, as Glencairn was captured by a group of Indian subjects who were eager to deliver to him the justice which he inflicted upon his ruled peoples so needlessly ruthlessly. The similarities, seemingly to the present, are uncanny, especially given that the final judge of the older British judge was an old homeless beggar, not unlike the individual recounting this particular story to the narrator. Borges at one point in the text reminds us of a saying that India is larger than the entire world. So large perhaps that time and space collapse in on of itself, all occurs at once, and Glencairn's corpse, or perhaps multiple judges' corpses represented as one single observed corpse, is present in a subsequent chamber. People remember the past even if it is all still occurring in the present, time effectively bleeding together. If The Shining was about America in general and Kubrick's perception of it, the skeletons in the closet, a Jewish American's unease that his home nation was built upon more than one Holocaust-scale slaughter, then perhaps Mulholland Drive was Lynch's take on Hollywood, a man who felt as though Sunset Boulevard was not just a scenario resigned to one fictional character, Gloria Swanson, but an affliction experienced by all taken with the Hollywood fantasy, performers and viewers alike, much as Adam Curtis suggested that the paranoia felt by Richard Nixon, due to the invasive, perhaps rightfully so, media was a sensation felt by everyone in the hyper-aware, hyper-PR-focused social media or bureaucratic database environment of the earlier 21st century. Just for a moment, consider Hollywood, the origins of modern celebrity culture, the cause of the dreams and aspirations and binary worldviews of many. So many profess to have been formerly motivated via Hollywood films, whether the Western genre's gunfighter morality, the Disney features saccharine unreal happiness, or the romance features reductionist yet cozy depictions of marriage and family life. A culture of self-gratification and enjoyed memories rather than Christian nobility, honour and duty, and hey, I prefer existing in the former. Christian nobility, honour and duty led to millions and millions of men dying in World War I, so no one was willing to take that notion seriously anymore. And so Hollywood emerged, especially given the destruction of Europe's film industry during the Great War, to define our dreams and aspirations well into the next century/millennium. Now, moving on from my nonsense, let's hear what my main man Mark Fisher had to say on Lynch's 21st century work in his Weird and the Eerie collection of essays. I recorded an audiobook of that entire text if you're interested, but I'll just read out this particular passage again. Okay. Curtains and Holes, David Lynch. David Lynch's two latest films, Mulholland Drive and Inland Empire, present a kind of acute, compacted weirdness. While often perplexing, Lynch's earlier work, including the film Blue Velvet 1986 and the television series Twin Peaks 1990-91, with a third series currently in production, presented what at first glance could appear to be a superficial coherence. Both the film and the TV series were, at least initially, constructed around the opposition between an idealized, stereotypical small-town America, not dissimilar from the one depicted in Dick's Time Out of Joint, and various other or underworlds, criminal, occult. The division between worlds was often marked by one of Lynch's frequently recurring visual motifs: curtains. Curtains both conceal and reveal, and not accidentally, one of the things that they conceal and reveal is the cinema screen itself. They do not only mark a threshold, they constitute, an egress to the outside. In Mulholland Drive, released in 2001, the stability of the opposition which had structured Blue Velvet and Twin Peaks begins to collapse. No doubt this is partly because of the shift away from the small town setting and the new focus on LA. Lynch's customary preoccupation with dreams in the one-eric is now refracted and redoubled by the mediated and manufactured dreams of the Dream Factory, Hollywood. The Hollywood setting proliferates embedded worlds, films within films, and possibly films within films within films, screen tests, performed roles, fantasies. Each embedding contains the possibility of a disembedding as something that was at a supposedly inferior ontological level threatens to climb up out of its subordinated position and claim equal status with the level above. Figments from dreams cross over into waking life. Screen tests appear at least as convincing as the exchanges in the supposedly real-world scenes that surround them. In Mulholland Drive, however, rendered in the on-screen title as Mulholland Dr, with its suggestion of Mulholland Dream, the overwhelming tendency appears to move in the opposite direction. It is not so much that dreams become taken for reality, as that any apparent reality subsides into a dream. But whose dream is it anyway? The standard interpretation of Mulholland Drive claims that its first half is the fantasy/dream of failed two-bit actress Diane Selwyn, Naomi Watts, whose actual life is allegedly depicted in all its quotidian squalor in the second half of the film. In the first part of the film, Betty assists an amnesiac brunette, Laura Haring, the victim of a failed murder plot, to recover her identity. The brunette assumes the name Rita after Rita Hayworth, a name she sees on a film poster, and she and Betty become lovers. In the second part of the film, Rita is now Camilla, a successful actress and the object of bitter jealousy from the failed and jaded Diane, who lives in a miserable apartment in Hollywood. Diane hires a hitman to kill Camilla before apparently committing suicide. According to the standard interpretation, aspiring actress Betty, who arrives in Hollywood seemingly not only from a small town but from the past, she has just won a jitterbugging competition, is Selwyn's idealized image of herself. The opposition between the idealized place and the underworlds that structured Blue Velvet and Twin Peaks has now become an opposition between two personae, naive small-town Betty versus hard-bitten LA resident Diane. In an online review, Double Dreams in Hollywood, Timothy Takamoto pointed out that one problem with the standard interpretation is that the second part of the film in its own way as dreamlike and as saturated in melodramatic tropes as the first. What is some woman in a rundown apartment in Hollywood doing having an affair with a movie star that is about to get married to a famous director? Where does she get the money to pay for a hitman? Takamoto's view is that both the first and second part of the film are dreams. Diane is not the dreamer. The real dreamer is elsewhere, and Betty/Diane and Rita/Camilla are all fragments of this unseen dreamer's disintegrated psyche. Whether or not this view is correct, I think that Takamoto is right to argue that there are two scenes in Mulholland Drive which merit particular attention. The scene about dreams in the diner, and the scene in Club Silencio, perhaps the most powerful sequence in the entire film. In the diner scene, a man called Dan is talking to someone who appears to be a psychiatrist about a dream he has had twice. The dream is set in the very diner in which they are currently sitting, Winkies, on Sunset Boulevard. In the dream, Dan is terrified by a figure with a blackened, scarred face who lurks in a hinterland space behind the diner. In a bid to defeat the power of the dream, the two men walk out to the back of the diner where the scarred figure is waiting, and Dan collapses, perhaps in a faint, perhaps dead. The paradoxically entrancing Club Silencio scene acts as a gateway between the two sections of the film. With its red curtains, Club Silencio is evidently a threshold space. Betty and Rita enter the club, but they do not properly emerge from it. They are afterwards replaced/displaced by Diane and Camilla. I describe the scene as paradoxically entrancing because it is ostensibly demystifying. Like some cinematic equivalent of Magritte's This Is Not a Pipe, the Club Silencio performance tells us that what we are witnessing is an illusion, whilst at the same time showing that we will be unable to treat it as such. The host of Club Silencio, a kind of magician compere figure, repeatedly tells the audience, those in Club Silencio as well as those watching Mulholland Drive, there is no band, it is all recorded, it is all a tape, it is an illusion. And a man emerges from behind the red curtain, appearing to play a muted trumpet. He takes the trumpet away from his mouth, but the music continues. When the singer Rebecca Del Rio appears to deliver an emotionally racked version of Roy Orbison's version of Crying, we are seduced by the power of her performance. So when Del Rio collapses but the music plays on, we cannot help but be shocked. Something in us compels us to treat the performance as if it were genuine. There is of course nothing less mendacious, less dissimulatory in cinema's history of illusion than the scene in Club Silencio. What we are seeing and hearing, the film itself, is indeed a recording and nothing but. On the most banal level, this is the material infrastructure which the magic of cinema must conceal. Yet the scene haunts for reasons other than this. It points to the automatisms at work in our subjectivity. Insofar as we cannot help but be drawn into Club Silencio's illusions, which are also the illusions of cinema, we are like the very recordings by which we are seduced. That these illusions are something more than mere deceptions. Like the scene of Dan in the diner, the Club Silencio scene reminds us that dreams and illusions are conduits to a real that cannot ordinarily be confronted. Dreams are not only spaces of solipsistic interiority, they are also a terrain in which the red curtains to the outside can open up. Ultimately, Mulholland Drive is perhaps best read as something which cannot be made to add up. That is not to say that the film should just be considered fair game for any possible interpretation. Rather, it is to say that any attempt finally to tie up the film's convolutions and impasses will only dissipate its strangeness, its formal weirdness. The weirdness here is generated in part by the way that the film feels like a wrong version of a recognizable Hollywood film type. Roger Ebert remarked that there is no solution, there may not even be a mystery. It could be that Mulholland Drive is the illusion of a mystery. We are compelled to treat it as a solvable enigma, to overlook its wrongness, its intractability, in the same way that, in Club Silencio, we are compelled to overlook the illusory nature of the performances.